I built a $4.2 million Tribeca penthouse empire to keep my wife happy. But what she did to me, when she abandoned 32 people on Thanksgiving, was completely insane. I need to tell you something, and you probably won't believe what happened, but this has been destroying me inside for months. My name is Jameson Morrison. I'm 35 years old, and I'm a partner at Cravath, Swaine & Moore, one of Manhattan's most prestigious law firms. Our Tribeca penthouse has Hudson River views, 3 bedrooms, a private terrace, and everything a woman could want. At least that's what I thought. Valentina Chen Morrison, my wife of 5 years, was always incredible at hosting dinners. She's a marketing executive, Chinese-American descent, intelligent, sophisticated, exactly the type of woman I always wanted by my side. When we met, she was living in a tiny Queens apartment, working 60 hours a week, dreaming of a better life. I gave her that. I gave her everything. The whole story started 3 days before Thanksgiving, when my mother, Beatrice B. Kensington Wells, arrived at our apartment with that determination I knew well. She's a former Vogue editor, 58 years old, and uses her social connections as a weapon when necessary. "Jameson, darling," she said, placing a list on our marble countertop like she was presenting evidence in court. "We need to discuss Thanksgiving arrangements." Valentina was in the kitchen, finishing washing dishes from the dinner she'd made for us. Pot roast with all the sides my mother had taught her to make the right way during our first year of marriage. Her hands were red from the hot water, but she never complained. "Of course," Valentina replied, forcing cheerfulness into her voice. "How can I help?" My mother unfolded the paper ceremoniously, and I saw Valentina's stomach contract when she read it. 32 names. Cousin Cynthia was bringing her new boyfriend. Uncle Frederick Fritz Pemberton was coming with his whole family. The Rothschild Hayes from the country club would be joining us too. 32 people, Valentina murmured. "Actually 32, my mother corrected. Little Benjamin Rothschild Hayes counts as half a person since he's only 6, but you should prepare for 30 full portions." Growing boy. I was on my phone, checking emails from Singapore, so I just nodded. "You got this, babe. You always do." I should have realized what was happening in that moment. I'll admit I might have neglected my wife and prioritized my work. But who can judge me? Tell me your opinion and subscribe, because what she had planned in secret will show you what real betrayal looks like. Valentina stared at the list, and I could see she was trying to process the logistics. In previous years we'd hosted maybe 15 people, and even then she'd start cooking 2 days early, barely sleep, and spend the entire dinner running back and forth between kitchen and dining room. "When did you invite all these people?" she asked, her voice smaller than intended. "Over the past few weeks," my mother said dismissively. "Don't worry about the timing, dear. You'll manage just fine. You always do." But my mother had pulled out another paper, this one covered in her precise handwriting. The complete menu. Turkey with 3 different stuffings, ham with pineapple glaze, 7 different side dishes, 4 desserts, including pumpkin pie with homemade crust. This is a lot for one person," Valentina said. My mother waved her hand as if she'd mentioned a minor inconvenience. "Nonsense. You're perfectly capable." I finally looked up from my phone. "I'll definitely help out. I can carve the turkey and open wine bottles." Carve the turkey. Open wine bottles. That was my idea of help for a meal that would require approximately 16 hours of active cooking time. Later that night, after my mother left and I fell asleep, Valentina sat at the kitchen table with a calculator trying to figure out the logistics. I found her there the next morning, surrounded by papers and lists, with deep dark circles under her eyes. "Everything okay, babe?" I asked, pouring myself coffee. "Yes," she lied. "Everything's under control." And in that moment, I really believed her. Valentina always made everything work. Always managed to pull off the impossible. Always smiled and said, "Of course," when we asked for things beyond reasonable. I had gotten used to letting her carry everything alone, not realizing she was secretly documenting every moment of negligence, every time I chose my work over her, preparing something that would change our lives forever. The next morning, Tuesday, I had that conference call with Singapore that could secure my partnership track for the next 5 years. This was a $50 million deal, and there was absolutely no way I was missing it. I woke up at 5:30 a.m. to find Valentina already in the kitchen, surrounded by grocery lists and recipe cards spread across every surface. She had her laptop open, comparing prices at different markets, calculating cooking times on a spreadsheet that looked more complex than some of my legal briefs. She looked up with those tired eyes, and I could tell she hadn't slept much. I was already checking my phone, reviewing notes for the Singapore call, when she started explaining something about turkey timing and oven space conflicts. "You'll figure it out, babe. You always do," I said while grabbing my coffee and heading to my office. Those words that I thought were supportive, but looking back, they were just me dismissing her very real concerns. The conference call lasted 4 hours. 4 crucial hours where Valentina was downstairs, trying to solve an impossible logistics puzzle, while I was focused on what felt like the most important deal of my career. When I finally emerged, mentally exhausted but thrilled about the preliminary approval, I found her in the pantry with a calculator, looking more stressed than I'd ever seen her. She tried to share my excitement about the deal, but I could see her mind was elsewhere, calculating pounds of potatoes and cross-referencing cooking times. That's when my mother called with the bombshell about Benjamin Rothschild Hayes having a severe nut allergy. I watched something change in Valentina's face when I told her. Not anger exactly, something colder. She had to redesign 3 dishes completely, with ingredients she didn't have, using recipes she hadn't tested, in a timeline that was already impossible. When she asked for real help, actual cooking assistance, I looked at my phone and saw 3 more calls scheduled, plus preparation for Thursday's follow-up meeting. "Val, you know I'm terrible in the kitchen. You're so much better at all this domestic stuff. And with this deal happening, I really need to stay focused." Domestic stuff. I actually called managing a dinner for 32 people domestic stuff. She turned back to her calculator without saying anything else. But I caught something in her expression that I'd never seen before. A kind of cool evaluation, like she was seeing me clearly for the first time. That night, I worked until almost midnight while Valentina prepped what she could in advance. When I finally went to bed, she was still in the kitchen, and I found her there the next morning too, having apparently worked through most of the night. Looking back, I realized that was the moment she stopped asking me for help, not because she didn't need it, but because she'd finally understood that I was never going to give it. Wednesday morning, the day before Thanksgiving, I woke up to incredible smells coming from the kitchen. Valentina had been up since 3 a.m., transforming our apartment into what looked like a professional catering operation. Every surface was covered with dishes in various stages of preparation. 3 different stuffings cooling on counters, homemade cranberry sauce simmering, 4 different timers managing a choreographed dance that would have impressed any restaurant kitchen. I was genuinely amazed by what she'd accomplished, feeling that familiar pride in having such a capable wife. Then my phone rang with Singapore wanting to discuss modifications to yesterday's terms, and I disappeared into my office for 2 hours. When I emerged, I found Valentina sitting on the kitchen floor, crying quietly while staring at her phone. She'd just discovered that my mother had uninvited cousin Ruby the week before. "Your mother told her that since she's going through a divorce and having such a difficult time, maybe she'd be more comfortable at a smaller, more appropriate gathering for her situation." The cruelty of that hit me hard. Ruby had been family for 8 years, but the moment her life became messy, my mother had cut her from the list. Then Valentina pointed out something that made my stomach drop. Her name wasn't anywhere on the guest list either. 32 people. But the woman cooking for 32 people wasn't even considered a guest at the dinner she was preparing. She'd be in the kitchen the entire time, serving, clearing plates, managing everything while everyone else ate and socialized. My mother called again, worried about the timeline, concerned that Valentina might be overwhelmed. She wanted to make sure the presentation would meet the Rothschild Hayes standards, emphasizing how important first impressions could be for my career networking. Career networking. My mother was treating my wife's back-breaking labor as an opportunity for my professional advancement, and I just stood there nodding along. That afternoon, I had to handle an office emergency. When I returned around 6 p.m., I found Valentina sitting at our dining table, which she'd set perfectly with our finest china and crystal. 32 place settings, arranged like something from a magazine. She was just sitting there with a glass of wine, staring at the empty chairs. "It looks incredible," I said, trying to lighten her mood. "I was just wondering what it would feel like to actually sit in one of these chairs tomorrow." "To be a guest instead of the help," she replied, with something in her tone that made me uncomfortable. I assured her she wasn't the help, that this was her home too. But when I said that, She just smiled in a way that wasn't warm at all and asked if it really was. That night, I suggested takeout so she could rest, but she barely touched the food. She kept checking her phone and making notes in a small notebook I'd never seen before. When I asked what she was writing, she said it was tomorrow's timeline. But when she closed it quickly, I'd glimpsed enough to see it wasn't a cooking schedule. Around 10 p.m., I found her with her laptop open to what looked like a travel website. She closed it immediately when I walked in, claiming she was just browsing, but I could have sworn I'd seen a flight booking page. Looking back, that should have been the moment I realized something was fundamentally wrong. Not just with dinner preparations, but with my wife, my marriage, and everything I thought I understood about my life. Thursday morning, Thanksgiving Day, I woke up expecting to find Valentina in full cooking mode, managing the choreographed chaos that always preceded our family gatherings. Instead, the apartment was completely silent. I padded downstairs to find the kitchen empty, not just of people, but of any activity. All the prep work from yesterday sat exactly where she'd left it. No turkey in the oven, no pots bubbling, no evidence that the Thanksgiving marathon had begun. On the counter, next to my mother's guest list, was a folded piece of paper with my name on it. My hands shook as I read it. Jameson, something came up and I had to leave town. You'll need to handle Thanksgiving dinner. The groceries are in the fridge. Valentina, she was gone. My wife, who had never missed a family obligation, who had never failed to deliver a perfect meal, who had never left me to handle anything domestic, was simply gone. My first thought was a family emergency, so I called her immediately, straight to voicemail. I called again, then called her sister Sophia, thinking maybe there'd been some crisis. But Sophia's family was fine, and when I explained that Valentina had vanished, leaving 32 people expecting dinner, her reaction wasn't concern. Jameson, are you insane? You expected your wife to cook for 32 people by herself? When I said Valentina was good at this stuff, Sophia corrected me sharply. She liked hosting intimate dinners with friends, not feeding an army of my relatives who treated her like hired help. By 8:15 a.m., panic was setting in. I had that crucial Singapore follow-up call starting in 45 minutes, but 32 people were expecting dinner in less than 6 hours. I'd never cooked a turkey in my life, never prepared anything more complicated than scrambled eggs. My mother arrived with grim determination, surveying the kitchen like a general assessing a battlefield where all the soldiers had deserted. We stared at the raw turkeys, the unprepared side dishes, the complete absence of any coherent plan. She announced that the turkeys should have been in the oven 4 hours ago, that physics doesn't bend to accommodate abandonment issues. We worked in tense silence, her barking instructions while I fumbled through tasks Valentina had always made look effortless. By noon, relatives were calling with questions about arrival times and dietary restrictions. Each conversation became more uncomfortable as I had to admit we needed backup dishes, that something was wrong with our dinner preparations. Word spread quickly through the family network. My phone buzzed constantly with confused relatives offering help, asking questions, trying to figure out if they should make alternative plans. The doorbell started ringing at 1 p.m. One by one, 32 people filed into our living room, finding me greeting them like I was hosting a funeral instead of a celebration. When Aunt Margaret asked where Valentina was, I said she'd had to step out for an emergency. That's when my phone buzzed with a text from Valentina's number. The entire room fell silent, sensing my reaction as I opened the message. A single photo. Valentina in a flowing sundress I'd never seen, sitting at a beachside restaurant with a tropical drink, her face radiant with peace. The message below read, "Thanksgiving dinner in paradise. Tell your mother the turkey is her problem now." Looking back, I realized this was when everything started spiraling beyond my control. Have you ever discovered your partner was planning to humiliate you for months? Trust me, what she had orchestrated was beyond anything I could have imagined. The photo on my phone showed Valentina in what was clearly a tropical paradise, probably Tulum or Cancun, looking more relaxed and beautiful than I'd seen her in years. While I stood in our living room, surrounded by 32 confused relatives and the smell of panic sweat, she was sipping cocktails on a beach. The room erupted when I couldn't hide what the message said. Voices overlapped as people tried to process that their hostess had abandoned Thanksgiving morning, leaving everyone stranded without dinner or explanation. Uncle Fritz asked what the plan was now. My mother emerged from the kitchen looking like she'd been through a war, flour in her hair and defeat in her voice, explaining that the single turkey we'd managed to get in the oven wouldn't be ready until evening. The Rothschild Hayes left immediately, citing concerns about their son's allergies and the obvious lack of proper meal management. Other relatives started making phone calls, trying to find restaurants that might still have availability, while others headed home to see what they could salvage from their own kitchens. By 3 p.m., what should have been our elegant Thanksgiving dinner had turned into a potluck disaster, with half our guests gone and the remaining family members sharing whatever Uncle Fritz and a few others had brought as backup dishes. I spent the afternoon calling every hotel and restaurant in Manhattan, getting the same response everywhere: laughter, followed by the information that Thanksgiving reservations had been booked for months. Even if they'd had availability, no one could prepare dinner for 32 people with 2 hours' notice. My mother kept muttering about the humiliation, about what the Rothschild Hayes would think, about how this would affect my standing at the country club. But I was beginning to realize that social embarrassment was the least of my problems. That evening, after the last confused relatives had left and my mother had gone home in defeat, I sat alone in our apartment, staring at the perfectly set dining table that no one had used. 32 place settings that Valentina had arranged with such care, now mocking reminders of the celebration that never happened. I tried calling her again, and this time she answered. Her voice sounded different, lighter somehow, with ocean sounds in the background. "I'm in Tulum, Jamie. I've been planning this for weeks. I finally reached my breaking point when I realized you would never see me as anything more than efficient domestic help." When I asked how she could do this to our family, to our guests, she said something that hit me harder than I expected. She asked when I'd started thinking of 32 people who contributed nothing as our family, while excluding her sister Sophia, who'd actually wanted to help. Then she mentioned something that made my blood run cold. She'd been documenting everything for months. Every time I'd chosen work over helping her, every dismissive comment, every moment I'd treated her like hired staff instead of my wife. She had records of it all. Photos, audio recordings, a detailed log of what she called my systematic neglect. And she was considering sharing it with someone who could make sure everyone knew exactly what kind of husband I really was. Before I could ask what she meant by that, she hung up, leaving me alone with the devastating realization that my wife hadn't just abandoned Thanksgiving dinner. She'd been building a case against me for months, and I had no idea what she was planning to do with it. The days that followed were a blur of humiliation and damage control. Word about our Thanksgiving disaster spread through Manhattan's social circles faster than I could have imagined, and with each retelling, the story got worse for me. By Monday, I was getting concerned calls from partners at my firm. The Rothschild Hayes had connections to several of our biggest clients, and their version of events painted me as unreliable, someone who couldn't even manage his own household effectively. "Jameson, what exactly happened on Thursday?" My senior partner, Richard Blackstone, asked during our weekly meeting. "The Hayes mentioned some kind of family crisis that left 30 guests without dinner." I tried to explain without making Valentina sound completely unhinged. "But how do you spin your wife abandoning Thanksgiving morning for a Mexican beach vacation?" Meanwhile, Valentina was posting photos from Tulum like she was on some kind of liberation tour. Beach sunsets, spa treatments, yoga sessions at dawn, her face glowing with what looked like genuine happiness. Each post felt like a deliberate slap, showing the world how much better off she was without me. But it was her sister Sophia's social media that really twisted the knife. She shared Valentina's posts with captions like, "Sometimes the bravest thing a woman can do is walk away from people who take her for granted," and "Watching my sister finally put herself first has been incredible to witness." The comments were brutal. Women I'd never heard of were calling Valentina a hero, sharing their own stories about ungrateful husbands and impossible in-laws. Someone had started a hashtag, Team Valentina, and it was gaining traction. I realized my wife hadn't just abandoned dinner. She'd somehow turned herself into a feminist icon overnight. Wednesday evening, exactly a week after our disaster, my mother called in tears. "The country club is asking questions, Jameson. Margaret Rothschild Hayes told 3 different committees that we're unreliable hosts. They're reconsidering my membership on the charity board." For the first time, I felt something shift inside me. My mother, who had created this impossible situation by inviting 32 people without consulting anyone, was crying about the consequences of her own actions. "Mom, maybe this is what we needed. Maybe we've been taking Valentina for granted. Taking her for granted? I gave that girl a lifestyle she never could have afforded on her own. I taught her how to host proper dinners, how to dress appropriately for our social circle. Everything she knows about being a suitable wife, she learned from me. That phrase, suitable wife, made my stomach turn. When had I started thinking about Valentina as an employee rather than a partner? Thursday night, she called me again. This time, her voice carried something I hadn't heard in years, confidence mixed with what sounded almost like pity. I've been thinking about our conversation last week. Jamie, about the documentation I mentioned. My blood ran cold. Valentina, whatever you're planning. I'm not planning anything vindictive. But I want you to understand something. Those records aren't just about you. They're about a system that turned a smart, capable woman into unpaid domestic labor while calling it love. She paused, and I could hear waves in the background, a sound that now felt like the soundtrack to my failure. I'm coming back Sunday, Jamie. But not to resume our old life. I'm coming back to pack my things and figure out what divorce looks like for someone who spent 5 years making herself invisible. The word divorce hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd been expecting it. Then she said something that would haunt me for weeks. The documentation I have, it's not really about destroying you, Jamie. It's about making sure other women can recognize the signs before they disappear completely. By Friday, I understood that whatever Valentina had planned was bigger than just leaving me. The documentation she'd mentioned wasn't some petty revenge scheme. It was evidence of something systemic that I'd been part of without even realizing it. I spent the weekend going through our shared spaces, really looking at them for the first time in years. The dining room where she'd hosted countless dinner parties for my colleagues and family. Always serving, never sitting. The kitchen where she'd spent hundreds of hours preparing meals that advanced my career, while hers remained stagnant. Our bedroom, where I'd fall asleep talking about my cases, my deals, my problems, while never asking about hers. Sunday afternoon, I was sitting in my office when I heard her key in the lock. My heart jumped, but when she walked in, she looked like a different person. Tanned, relaxed, wearing clothes I'd never seen before, she moved through our apartment like she was visiting a museum of her former life. "You look good," I said, not knowing what else to offer. "I feel good, Jamie. For the first time in years, I feel like myself again." She started packing efficiently, methodically, like she'd planned exactly what she needed and what she was leaving behind. Watching her fold clothes that I'd bought for her, that my mother had approved of, I realized how little of our life together had actually been hers. "About the documentation," I started, but she held up her hand. "Let me show you something," she said, pulling out her phone. What she showed me made my stomach drop. Screenshots of conversations with other women, dozens of them, all married to successful men in our social circle, all describing the same patterns, the same invisible labor, the same gradual disappearance of their own identities. This isn't about you specifically, Jamie. This is about all of us. About a whole system that turns wives into efficient household managers while calling it a partnership. She scrolled through message after message. Women talking about cooking for their husbands' clients while their own careers stagnated. Mothers organizing elaborate birthday parties for children, while their partners took credit for being good fathers. Wives managing elderly in-laws while their husbands claimed work was too demanding to help. "How many women are in this group?" I asked. 47 so far. "All from families, you know. All married to men in finance, law, consulting. All of them invisible in their own lives." The scope of what she'd discovered terrified me. This wasn't just about our marriage failing. It was about exposing an entire social system that I'd benefited from without question. "What are you planning to do with all this?" She zipped up her suitcase and looked at me directly for the first time since she'd returned. "I'm writing a book, Jamie. About the invisible women of Manhattan's upper class. About how we're trained to disappear behind our husband's success while calling it love." A book. She was planning to publish our private life, our family's secrets, the inner workings of a social circle that valued discretion above all else. My mother will never recover from something like that. "The families you're talking about, they'll destroy you legally." "Let them try," she said with a calm that was more frightening than anger would have been. "I have documentation of everything. Audio recordings, financial records showing how wives' careers are systematically derailed. I have enough evidence to show patterns of psychological manipulation that most people would call abusive if it weren't wrapped up in expensive jewelry and country club memberships. Before I could respond, she was walking toward the door with her suitcase. The book comes out next year. Jamie. Publishers are very interested in stories about how intelligent women get systematically erased by the men who claim to love them. Valentina, please. We can work this out. I can change. She turned back with that same expression of pity I'd heard in her voice. You can't change a system, Jamie. You can only decide whether you want to be part of it or not. The door closed behind her, and I was left alone in an apartment that had never felt emptier, facing the realization that my wife hadn't just left me. She'd built a case against an entire way of life that I'd never questioned. I had no idea how many other marriages were about to implode when her story went public. 3 months later, I finally understood what Valentina had really been fighting against. And it wasn't just me. The system that had destroyed our marriage was bigger and more insidious than I'd ever imagined. Her book proposal had leaked to the media before it was even published. The Invisible Wives of Manhattan was being described as a bombshell exposé that would name names, include audio recordings, and detail financial evidence of systematic career sabotage among New York's elite couples. But here's what nobody saw coming, including myself. As the story broke and other wives started speaking out, I realized that I hadn't been the mastermind of some elaborate control scheme. I'd been following a script that had been written decades before I was born. A script that every successful man in my circle followed without question. My father had treated my mother the same way, his father before him. It wasn't personal malice, it was generational programming that none of us had ever examined. When I called my father to discuss the media coverage, his response revealed everything. Son, this is what happens when you marry someone who doesn't understand their role in a successful man's life. Your mother knew her job was to make me look good, support my career, manage our social obligations. That's what good wives do. But Dad, what about Valentina's career? Her dreams? What about them? You provided her with a lifestyle most women would kill for. A beautiful home, financial security, social status. If she wanted something else, she should have married someone else. That conversation changed everything for me. I realized that what I'd thought was love had actually been a transaction that I'd never acknowledged. A deal where Valentina traded her identity for financial security and social acceptance. But the more I learned about the other couples in Valentina's book, the more I understood that calling it abuse oversimplified something much more complex. These women hadn't been forced into these arrangements. They'd been systematically trained from childhood to see this erasure as success, as winning the game of marriage. Sophia called me the week before the book's publication. I need you to know something, Jameson. Valentina doesn't hate you. She told me that writing about your marriage was the hardest part of the whole project, because she knows you were raised to see this as normal, just like she was raised to accept it. Then why destroy everything publicly? Because individual change isn't enough. The whole system has to be exposed before anyone can choose differently. The book was published on a Tuesday in March, and by Thursday, 3 wives from our social circle had filed for divorce. By the following week, that number had risen to 12. The media called it the Manhattan Wives Revolution. But what I saw was something more devastating. I saw marriages that had looked perfect from the outside crumbling, under the weight of truths that could no longer be ignored. My mother called me, crying after reading the chapter about our Thanksgiving disaster. She made me sound like a monster, Jameson. Like I deliberately set her up to fail. Did you, Mom? The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. I gave her an opportunity to prove herself as part of our family. If she couldn't handle it, maybe she wasn't right for you. And there it was, the truth I'd been avoiding. My mother had set Valentina up to fail, and I'd been too focused on my own career to see it happening. We'd both treated my wife like an employee on probation, rather than family. The system Valentina was exposing wasn't just about individual bad marriages. It was about a culture that trained successful men to see wives as accessories to their success, rather than partners in building something together. But here's the part that nobody wants to admit. Valentina's book wasn't just destroying marriages. It was forcing everyone to choose sides in a war that had been going on for generations, and I was finally beginning to understand which side I wanted to be on. 6 months after Valentina's book was published, I was sitting in a divorce attorney's office, signing papers that would legally end our marriage while trying to figure out who I wanted to become in whatever came next. The media attention had been brutal, but not in the way I'd expected. Instead of painting me as a villain, most articles describe me as a symbol of systemic problems, rather than individual evil. Valentina had been careful in her writing to show how men like me were products of the same system that had erased her, just beneficiaries instead of victims. Your wife has been unusually generous in the settlement negotiations. My lawyer, Patricia Chen, no relation to Valentina, told me as I reviewed the documents. She was keeping the apartment in Tulum that she'd bought with money she'd been secretly saving for 2 years. I was keeping our Tribeca place and most of our joint investments. She wanted nothing from my family, no ongoing support, no claim to my future earnings. She just wants to be free, I said, understanding finally what that meant. The past 6 months had been a masterclass in seeing my own life clearly. Valentina's book had included audio recordings of conversations I'd completely forgotten. Moments where I'd dismissed her career concerns, her request for help, her attempts to discuss our future as a partnership rather than my success story. Hearing my own voice treating her like an efficient assistant, rather than my wife had been devastating. But what surprised me most was discovering that I wasn't angry with her anymore. The public humiliation, the social ostracism, the career complications, all of it felt like consequences I'd earned rather than punishment I didn't deserve. My mother, on the other hand, had hired a publicist and was giving interviews about how modern women didn't understand the art of supporting their husbands. She'd become the face of defending traditional marriage roles, which made family dinners incredibly uncomfortable. "Jameson, you need to fight back against this narrative," she told me during our last conversation. "Valentina has painted you as some kind of oppressor, when all you did was provide for her exactly the way your father provided for me. And how did that work out for you, Mom?" The question hung in the air because we both knew the answer. My parents had one of those marriages that looked perfect from the outside while being emotionally hollow at the center. My mother had spent 40 years managing my father's life while slowly disappearing into the role of efficient household manager. She'd raised me to replicate their dynamic without ever asking if that was what I actually wanted in a marriage. 3 weeks before our divorce was finalized, Valentina called me. She was back in New York for a book signing and media interviews, and she wanted to have coffee to discuss something she called closure. We met at a small cafe in the village, far from anywhere we might run into people from our former social circle. "You look different," she said when she saw me. I'd lost weight, started therapy, quit the country club, and begun questioning everything about the life I'd built. "I feel different, like I'm figuring out who I am when I'm not performing success for other people." We talked for 2 hours about what we'd learned from the wreckage of our marriage. She told me about the hundreds of women who'd reached out after reading her book, wives who were just beginning to recognize their own erasure. I told her about the men who'd contacted me privately, asking how to build different kinds of partnerships with their wives. "I want you to know something, Jamie. Writing about us wasn't revenge. It was the only way I could think of to break a cycle that was destroying both of us. I know that now. I wish I'd understood it sooner." As she got up to leave, she paused and looked back at me. "The man you're becoming now, the one who's asking these questions and doing this work, that's the man I fell in love with before we both got lost in expectations that weren't even ours." Walking home alone through streets where I'd once felt like I owned the world, I realized that losing everything I thought I wanted had given me a chance to discover what I actually needed. But I couldn't help wondering how many other marriages were going to have to implode before people learned to choose differently from the beginning. But here's what nobody saw coming, including myself. 2 years after our divorce was finalized, Valentina and I ended up in the same grief counseling group, both there for different reasons, but dealing with similar losses of identity. She was there processing the end of her relationship with Marcus, a publisher she'd been dating who turned out to have his own issues with successful women. I was there trying to understand why every relationship I'd attempted since our divorce felt shallow and transactional. "It's weird seeing you here," she said after our third group session when we found ourselves walking toward the subway together. "Weird how? I spent so long thinking that leaving you would solve everything, that the problem was you specifically rather than patterns I kept repeating." We started having coffee after group sessions, not because we were reconnecting romantically, but because we'd both discovered that understanding our failed marriage had become crucial to building better relationships with other people. "I think I trained you to treat me like an employee," she told me one afternoon. 6 months into these conversations, I was so desperate to be the perfect wife that I never asked for what I actually wanted, and I was so desperate to be the successful husband that I never asked what you wanted either. The coffee conversations turned into dinners, and the dinners turned into something neither of us had expected. Not a reconciliation, but a friendship built on the ruins of the people we used to be. Valentina had written 2 more books and become a speaker at conferences about women's career development. She'd built the life she'd dreamed about during those lonely nights planning Thanksgiving. Dinners for people who didn't see her. I'd left corporate law and started a nonprofit helping men recognize and change controlling patterns in their relationships. The work paid a fraction of what I'd made at the firm, but I woke up every day feeling like I was contributing something meaningful instead of just accumulating wealth and status. "Do you think we could have figured this out without destroying everything first?" she asked me one night as we walked through Central Park. Honestly, I don't think so. We were both too invested in performing roles that had been written for us decades ago. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd just sat you down that Tuesday before Thanksgiving and explained how impossible the situation was instead of planning my escape. I probably would have told you to hire a caterer and missed the entire point. We both laughed, but it was the kind of laughter that comes from recognizing painful truths. The question I get most often when people hear our story is whether we ever considered getting back together. The answer is complicated because the people who fell in love originally don't exist anymore. But the people we became through the wreckage understand each other in ways that feel deeper than romance. Valentina is now engaged to David, a college professor who encourages her ambitions and shares household responsibilities without being asked. I'm dating Sarah, a therapist who calls me out when I slip into old patterns and doesn't need me to provide her with a lifestyle she can't create herself. We're all having dinner together next month, a kind of celebration of how families can evolve when people choose healing over resentment. Don't forget to subscribe. Listen. I hope my story teaches you something about what happens when love turns into a performance that exhausts everyone involved. My mother still doesn't speak to Valentina, still believes that modern women don't understand the art of marriage, but she started asking questions about my work with men's groups. Questions that suggest she's beginning to wonder if the life she chose was the only option available. The system that destroyed our marriage is still intact, still training successful men to expect invisible labor from their wives while teaching women to compete for the privilege of providing it. But individual people are choosing differently now, building partnerships instead of performance pieces. Valentina wanted me to feel the weight of managing everything alone, to understand what she'd been carrying all those years. And in the end, that's exactly what happened. The question is, when someone gets precisely what they asked for, who's really responsible for what comes next?